Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Dragon Prince online podcast. This is going to be episode 2, where myself and Greg are going to discuss season 2 or book 2 of the Dragon Prince, which is book 2 Sky. I'm going to be your main host for this podcast, Morgan, Airspeed Prime, and joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So we obviously did one of these back when the first season came out, and in general I think we liked it, maybe weren't completely convinced by it, but now we've had the second season, the second batch of 9 episodes, and we're back to discuss it. So we'll start off with some general discussion about just the season 2 in general, and then we'll get into going into the specifics by going through episode by episode. So we'll start with episode 1 all the way up to episode 9 of book 2 and discuss as many points as we need to. So, let's start off with just general thoughts on Book 2, Sky. So, overall, Greg, what were your thoughts on this second season of The Dragon Prince?
Overall, I thought it was pretty good. I don't think I have any I don't know, I guess sort of like major issues with it. I guess, I don't know, I think I'm still not sort of like super sold on it still. I think it still has, some things that it could do to sort of make it a bit maybe more interesting, but I think this is definitely sort of, I don't know, I feel like there's more progress with this season. I think there's definitely, they definitely fleshed out, I think, a bit more of the world, at least on the human side, which I think is definitely pretty good just to sort of see, sort of what has happened in the past. I think that definitely was probably the strongest part for this season for me specifically, especially some of the later episodes. I think that definitely worked pretty well, and it's something we've sort of mentioned before. So I think for the most part, I think it did pretty well. I think I'm still waiting for a bit more. So I'm still hoping that they continue it, to sort of find out sort of what happens later on. But I think it's still going in the direction.
In general, I'm still enjoying The Dragon Prince, but like you, I'm not fully convinced. I'm not fully in just yet, and I think a large part of that is that this format, 9-episode seasons, I don't think is the most ideal, because this season especially felt like the first 3 episodes kind of should have been just the ending of last season, and that meant we really only kind of had 6 episodes that kind of like moved on to something else, and then for the most part, we have a kind of book 1 Water from Avatar situation where it's just a journey, but the journey doesn't feel very distinct in terms of like where the main characters are going, in that none of the locations that they've been to really feel all that like unique or interesting, which I think, while there's cool world building with like the magic and the elves and like dragons, but the actual locations in the world right now don't feel all that great, and the world kind of just feels a little too generic fantasy for me right now. Obviously we're going into Xadia, where the stuff is meant to be a bit more kind of unique, but we haven't seen any of it really just yet. So it still feels a little small in scale, and that they haven't fully dived into the world fully. I like some of the other world building going on, but again, I feel like they're maybe holding back just a little bit too much, and they probably should be a bit more open with what exactly they're doing. I think the strength of the show is still its like character writing. That stuff is really good pretty much whenever they decide to do it. But if they manage to improve a lot of the stuff around that, I think we'd have a really, really, really good show on our hands. But this season definitely has some good moments. Like you said, the backstory I think is definitely the highlight of the season. Beyond that, it's kind of just setting stuff up going forward, and so I think the biggest complaint I'd probably level at this season is just like it's called Book 2 Sky, but like it doesn't really feel like it has much of a like distinction on its own as a season. Like, what exactly did these 9 episodes do? And it's like Callum started to learn magic, and that doesn't really feel that great as just a like individual thing that was kind of accomplished this season. So I don't know, maybe I just don't need I should probably just stop looking at the books as being so like distinct from each other, but given that they're doing the Avatar thing of calling them books and chapters, it kind of feels a bit weird that they don't feel all that unique, apart from like book 1 was Moon, so it kind of had more Moon stuff than this season, but we still were dealing with Moon for a lot of the start of this, and then Sky is here, but it's not as big of a focus as you'd think. So it's still sort of mixed on it, but I think it is still a very, very interesting show. So I think one of the only other things we need to discuss before we get into specifics is the animation. I think when we discussed book one, I think this was probably the universal complaint between the two of us, and really the entire fandom, in terms of like, if there's one thing you could level at this show for just being like, you need to fix this, it was the animation, specifically the frame rate problem. And they said before the season came out that they fixed it, and I think for the most part they accomplished that. I didn't really find myself kind of being taken out of the show because of weird slow bits of the animation. There are little tiny things here and there in that, like, they can still improve, of course, but I think it's got to the point now where, like any computer animated show, it's just going to naturally improve as the seasons go on. Like, we're only 18 episodes in now. I think they're just going to naturally improve, but they fixed the obvious, like, major technical problem I think that they had. But Greg, what are your thoughts on the animation for this season? Do you think they've fixed the overall problem?
I mean, yeah, I think either they fixed it or they just kept it more consistent, which is fixing it. So no, I think for the most part, I didn't have any major issues. I can't think of maybe there's maybe one or two spots where I noticed it looked a bit different, but I mean, like before, I mean, all the action scenes are always done pretty well, so that was never really the issue. It's really just the slow bits here, and I think at least for the most sort of important slower moments, or just things where people aren't sort of like jumping all around, I think those worked fine for me.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, with those general points out of the way, we'll get into going through episode by episode. So the first episode of book two was called A Secret and a Spark. So we got a little bit of a recap of the first season here at the start. I felt it was a little bit unnecessary, given that there's only been 9 episodes, but it only ended up taking up in around a minute of the episode. But it was still a bit weird that our introduction into the second season felt so recappy of the first one. Like, obviously we're still in this kind of moon nexus area at the top of the mountain, and that's where we stay for these first kind of handful of episodes. But this one, basically, like the title says, is all about kind of Callum questioning Lujane at the top of the mountain about how a human can attempt to learn magic. And he basically learns that, okay, humans don't have that connection to the primal sources, and the reason that elves and other magical creatures do is that they have this thing called the arcanum of their specific kind of magic. So she has the moon arcanum, which is this kind of understanding of kind of the philosophy of kind of moon magic, of like appearances versus reality and so on. And she just gets across the idea that dark magic isn't actual magic, and that humans can't ever learn or get the arcanum for the other type of magic. There's a few other things going on, the issue of like, should they leave right now or not, but for the most part it's just Ezran tries to teach Zim how to fly, and then right at the end Soren and Claudia find them right at the end. But that's for the most part what this one is about. And then the only other notable thing I think in the first episode is that Viren steals the king's seal and then sends the call for the summit of the Pentarchy, all the 5 human kingdoms. So some plot going on in the background. Oh, I almost forgot. There's that almost kind of weird bit at the start that's kind of a weird plot thread of just Amaya fighting the Sunfire Elves on the border. It's to get across the threat of war, but because she never speaks, it just feels very weird, and they just always cut to it just to have some action. But what were your thoughts on this first episode?
Yeah, no, that is an interesting part. I mean, I thought it was definitely cool. I mean, it's always cool to see fight. But yeah, that is, I don't know, I guess it's really just sort of, I guess it's trying to sort of add emphasis to Varen's sort of, idea that they're, still close to being attacked and taken over, which I don't know. I mean, it definitely doesn't seem that much, but overall, I thought, I think it was a good episode, I guess, to sort of intro into this whole sort of area. It did a good job of that, and sort of explaining sort of, more world building on sort of the magic, and explaining that to Callum, and sort of, getting that whole sort of idea across. So I think, for that part, I think it works. It definitely, I don't know. I mean, it definitely, this definitely could have been something that could have been part of, the last season, I guess, as far as that. But I mean, it does do a nice job of just sort of bringing more to the story. So I think, I like the fact that it has more explanations in it. But I don't know. I guess it definitely seems like they spent a long time, I guess, sort of just to explain sort of the idea of magic to Callum, which that is sort of like his thing, obviously. So it's probably worth it to spend some time with it. But he doesn't gain. I mean, he gains some understanding from it, from her sort of explanation, but no, not so much specific to what magic he eventually sort of learns.
Hmm. And then there is one other thing that happens here. The whole lie. Rayla still can't bring herself to tell Callum and Ezrin about what happened to their father. So that kind of becomes a plot point as the episodes progress. But for the most part, that's really kind of all that's going on here. There's a bunch of jokes from Lujane getting across her kind of sense of humor with the illusionist and the whole. She constantly makes nice food, but it's just like illusion of like bugs, basically. Um, she explains the idea of the different primal nexuses. There's like 6 of them, and we see the moon nexus here, which is this kind of pond that completely reflects the moon and is the, I suppose, ultimate source of moon energy in the world. So that's cool. It gives us the idea that there's at least 5 other cool locations related to the other elements. That's going to be kind of cool to see. The second episode is called Half Moon Lies, and this is obviously where Soren and Claudio get properly kind of reintroduced into things. They initially fight Rayla, Callum comes in, calms everything down, and they basically play on the idea of Callum is friends both with Soren and Claudia, but also with Rayla, and she immediately sees them as a threat, but he's obviously friends with them, and it's about them, how do they balance basically the idea of being his friend, but also having to fulfill the kind of secret mission of their father of having to either take the princes back or potentially kill them if it goes wrong. So, a lot of little things happen here, like they get to meet Zim, so they realize that the dragon egg is hatched. We also get the more on the idea that obviously we know Callum has a crush on Claudia, and we start to see a lot of kind of chemistry between those two, and you're questioning the entire episode basically, like, is she just kind of playing up the sort of flirting with him because she's trying to get him to trust her, or does she actually like him too? And I think they play on that really well to the point where you're kind of unsure, but there's enough real moments from Claudia where you kind of get the idea that there probably is some actual good chemistry between the two of them, in that like they basically go on a date here, and it's fun and awkward, and I think it kind of works quite well, and they nearly even kiss actually as well at the end. And then I think the other side of the episode is Soren trying to kill Ezrin by having this zip line accident, and Rayla finds him out. So yeah, the whole idea of trust basically is what this episode is about. But what are your thoughts on episode 2?
Yeah, no, I think the idea of seeing, just how these different sort of relationships are working in this episode, I think, for the most part for me, that actually worked pretty well. I mean, you can see sort of the dynamic that Callum and Claudia have here. And, it seems like, they've been around each other enough that they have, some history. And you can see Callum, obviously he already has, a crush on her. So, I don't know. With Claudia, it's always interesting her character, just because she's a dark magician, so but she has like this sort of like nice sort of like bubbly personality. So I don't know. It's an interesting sort of contrast, sort of how that works, especially in some of the later episodes. That I think that comes into play even more so. But here, seeing how they're trying to sort of trust them, as far as being Callum and Ezra's friends from way back when or whatever, obviously more than Rayla, but Rayla, she can see that there's more going on here, and of course by the end of this whole thing you sort of figure out what their real sort of goals are going on here. But no, I think the episode is interesting just to see that sort of dynamic here. I think that worked pretty well. Just the fact that they're in this sort of area here, I think was interesting. I don't know, for some reason I expected the Moon Mage to have more of a problem with Claudia being there, just because of her being sort of a dark magician, but I guess they didn't, they didn't really choose to focus on that for this part here. But no, I think this episode definitely, it picks up a bit more with the dynamics that are going on.
Yeah, I suppose just with like kind of Lou Jane in general, it was kind of interesting how across these 3 episodes before they leave, they did enough to get across the idea that, like, okay, she's a more kind of experienced kind of mage and user of magic, but she's not like Iroh type thing. She doesn't actually have that great wisdom in the grand scheme of things. That she is just this illusionist, so she kind of gives the illusion of kind of having all this kind of advice when for the most part she doesn't. She's just, here to do her role, protecting this place, and she's not really as like wise, kind of ancient as you maybe would expect. But there's a few other little bits that happens here. We start to get the first steps of Viren and the mirror going on here, and we see it activating actually for the first time, in that I think he uses fire magic, but then he kind of takes it away, and when the room is dark, that's suddenly when the mirror activates and it reveals this room. He can just see into this room. That it doesn't appear to be anything overly special about it just yet, but it's just the idea that it's finally activated for him. And then right at the end of the episode, we get that Claudia does interrupt their kiss, basically, to reveal that Harrow has actually died. And so that's where the episode ends, with the idea that Claudia has just kind of, in a way, jumped ahead of Rayla to reveal this secret. And it sort of is meant to sort of create a bit of a rift between Rayla and Callum, because she's been holding this from him the entire time. So that is tackled in episode 3, which is called Smoke and Mirrors. And I suppose we'll address this thing, just this reveal coming out just to Callum here. Callum gets the reveal here. It takes a while for Ezran to get this reveal. Greg, what were your thoughts on how they did this? In that, like, we see the reaction from Claudia to having to reveal this to Callum himself, and also Rayla with keeping the lie. What were your thoughts on how they did this?
I think that worked, pretty well. I mean, I think that's probably the part where you really see sort of the connection that Claudia and Callum have, because, she could have, really, tried to hold back on that and not told him, but, she felt that in that moment that it was really sort of important to sort of tell. So I think that's probably where, you probably feel that they had the most connection, just because she was willing to sort of tell him in that moment there. And then, when he's, understandably, he's, sort of upset about this and doesn't really sort of want to speak to Rayla about this or anything like that. But then you can see, it's interesting just to see, how quickly, later on he can sort of understand the same sort of aspect of that when he tries to tell Ezra, and that sort of, obviously that's a very sort of tough thing, and that reveal doesn't come for a bunch of, a couple more episodes later on. So I think it's interesting how that loss can sort of bring them together, or by the end of it sort of create an even sort of bigger rift later on, which we'll see if that's ever something that can be sort of, I guess, sort of mended between Callum and Claudia. But there's other issues there as well. But no, I think that was done pretty well.
Yeah, I like in the aftermath of this how they immediately had Callum try to tell Ezran. He basically has the exact same reaction that Rayla did in trying to tell him, and he now understands why Rayla did what she did and goes to talk to her, and they just have this sort of understanding moment. I thought that was kind of unique in that I don't think I've seen that dynamic before, at least them getting across that idea of just the kind of understanding of, like, that's why you kind of just held back to spare my feelings, and both of them kind of understanding it in that way, and just not making it that big of a drama thing to keep going forever. In that, for the most part, they don't play up the romance triangle all that much, because we do get towards the end, I think, that, like, Rayla seems to like Callum, but, like, it's never overly outwardly stated, but she does seem a bit jealous of the kind of connection that Callum and Claudia seem to have, but Claudia doesn't seem to care too much about Rayla, and that she even asks Callum if they're, like, going out or anything like that. So I thought that was just interesting how they overall approached it. The other side of this is that, they go to leave, and Rayla comes up with a plan because she knows that some sort of betrayal is coming, and this is where they use the collar that was on Ava, the dog that's missing the leg, but instead of giving the leg back, it creates an illusion of Callum, Zim, and Ezran. So Claudia and Soren do betray them, but they don't capture the real Callum and Ezran. So this is the kind of confirmation that Rayla was right. They have betrayed everyone. It's this big emotional moment, but they do manage to escape on Fifi, the kind of moon phoenix thing, and Corvus also arrives in here to stop Claudia, which is kind of his reintroduction into things. So yeah, that was interesting enough. There was some dark magic going on here. A lot of Rayla fighting Soren, like sword to sword this season as well, and just them kind of having back and forths. They didn't try to, I think, really lean into like they're going to have any sort of a relationship type thing, but just they're both the two sword users, so they fight a lot. But you know, they have an interesting back and forth because Soren's kind of a bit of an idiot and Rayla's kind of really snappy. But what were your thoughts on the betrayal scene?
Yeah, no, you saw that sort of coming, so I guess it's not really sort of a surprise, but the characters, Cal, like us, probably more so, definitely sort of feels it there, and it makes you, at the moment right before sort of chorus comes in, you sort of wonder. Would have Claudia sort of let them go? I don't really know. I don't probably not. I don't know. That would have been an interesting one to see sort of how that would have turned out. But no, I think the setup was there, so it was bound to happen. I wonder if there's any sort of later on if there's any way that they can sort of reconcile this. I don't know. It would be interesting to see how that sort of works out. Just the whole idea of I don't know Claudia being a dark magician. I think is interesting. Just wondering how that's going to work out.
Mm. Yeah, I think it somewhat helped by the fact that like I think there were a lot of real moments between Claudia and Callum, and that she gives him the letter back in this episode. She was the one to reveal to him the truth and be the one to kind of stop Soren when he continues to try and lie about what happened to Harrow. So obviously the next time they meet, it is going to be a bit of a confrontation, but I think it's not just a kind of complete and utter betrayal, especially depending on how the news of Viren kind of being who he is gets out. Um, but the letters coming back as an important plot point, and then I think the only other part of this episode is Viren in the room sees Aravos for the first time. So we don't get his name here, but we see the idea that he's one of these star elves because we can see his skin, and he's just kind of walking around the room, and he acts like the mirror to him is just a normal mirror, even though Viren can see him. But right at the end of the episode, it's kind of clear that on the other side, he can also see him. So it's a slow build on the whole mirror plot side of things here, but just to reveal that, oh, here's this star elf guy, and then I think they confirmed on like social media and stuff like that Aravos is the star elf from like the very first episode of the show, who's with like the leader of the Sunfire Elves and the Moon Elves when they like exile the humans to the other side of the world. So he is that guy. So there's just a lot of interesting connections with him. But I suppose just on this section of it, do you have any thoughts on the kind of slow build here before they properly communicate on what Viren was doing with the mirror?
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting how they chose to do it. So, just in little tidbits over the course of these episodes. I mean, I guess it doesn't really need sort of a focus as much until later on when it really sort of comes into play. But I don't know. I think it's definitely interesting. I don't know. It keeps it somewhat intriguing that there's another thing going on that doesn't take too much sort of screen time. So it's worth it.
Episode 4 is Voyage of the Ruthless. Personally, I think this is probably the weakest episode of the season. We get more Amaya outpost fighting here. I was kind of confused about what exactly they were talking about. Just the few lines of dialogue that we did get here was like, the outpost is signaling us, like someone's in there, but it was a trap. I get it's just like meant to be scuffles on the border before the war is coming, but it felt like they kind of overdid it, and that like I don't think you needed the scene in the first episode and this episode to get that across, but they wanted to give like some Amaya fight scenes, and that we don't have too many fight scenes this season. We see that again, the stuff with Vera, and like they can't talk to each other through the mirror, so they have to do kind of like visual communication. In terms of the main plot, Fifi kind of leaves them off at this town, and they basically just reveal that, oh yeah, to get to Xadia, we need to cross this giant ocean. They have to go on a boat. Rayla's afraid of water, but she's willing to do it because this is the quickest way to do it. We get a little bit of human Rayla again, and the thing with Aravos and Viren is that Arvo seems to be instructing Viren to make a specific magic potion or spell, which he does right up until like a certain point. He makes the potion, he drinks it, but he stops at the point where Arvos tells him to basically put some blood into it by cutting his hand. Yeah, they meet this kind of blind pirate captain guy. I forget what his name was because he's not that important. And basically they just try to connect with the idea of like the pirate captain has this sort of sailing connection to the wind and like the weather because he can steer both while blind, and Callum tries to get a connection there. The storm, he makes a bad move by bringing Zim into the storm. He doesn't get the connection, but Zim seems to get some sort of a power up by being hit by lightning. And the major plot point here really is that the letters from the other kingdoms comes back, and the summit is going to happen. But obviously Viren's doing this behind his country's back, and he's going there as the leader, even though he's not actually the official representative. And then the other thing is we get to see the, I suppose, special sun form of the Sunfire Elves, that they go all magma, basically, which I thought was pretty cool. In that, okay, cool, all the elves have a special power-up type thing, not just the Moonshadow Elves. That was nice to see, but not the most interesting episode for me. But Greg, what were your thoughts on episode 4?
I mean, I think it was okay. I think it's probably just one of those episodes that sort of, continues on the series, just sort of moves the story along. I mean, there's a couple sort of like nice sort of, I guess sort of key moments in there, like you sort of mentioned, like you get a little bit of human Rayla, and, she has sort of a little bit of a heart to heart as well as Callum as well, which is interesting with what is it, Captain Villads, or the silent, but I don't know. So he probably has more wisdom than the Moon Mage, even if he is sort of like this oddball sort of character. He sort of gives them some sort of idea of what their what our two sort of young characters goals might be in the future. But no, I don't know. I mean, I think it's sort of definitely sort of pushes things along. I mean, I think probably for the most part, I'd like the idea of Callum, getting some sort of idea of sort of, I don't know, just sort of trying to push through with sort of his idea of somehow sort of trying to figure out magic, even though by the end of it he realizes that his idea of trying to get struck by lightning, which of course reminded me of Zuko, just sort of that sort of idea of sort of trying to go through extreme lengths to sort of get what you want. Maybe there might be sort of a better route to do it. But no, I think I don't know, the episode, it has some nice sort of action bits along it, which I think makes it sort of interesting. But I don't know, it just sort of it pushes things through, I guess.
Yeah, I think my problem with this episode is just that, like I said at the start, the journey to get to Xadia is kind of dull in terms of the actual traveling, in that if you like take all the episodes up to now, it's just been like they go to one town, then they immediately go up the mountain to where the Moon Mage is. They fly a bit, come to this city, and then just sail to a cave, which they wait at for a while, and then they just cross into Xadia. It's a really boring kind of journey, and like especially like, coming from one of the writers of Avatar, where like obviously book 1 most people consider to be the weaker one, but the journey throughout book 1 is still fun. You get to see different parts of the Fire Nation, different islands, Earth Kingdom, and you get a sense of what the world is actually like along the way. And it's so interesting that this show is kind of missing that in terms of the kind of locations a bit, and that we're just sailing for a bunch of episodes. We spend like 6 episodes on top of the kind of moon nexus, but we're sailing for like 2 episodes and nothing feels overly unique. But maybe they're saving the big locations kind of for what's coming up next. And then I suppose with Viren, the only other thing I'd say is I like that at this point that he's not so desperate that he's willing to take the big risks with whatever's going on in the mirror, that he's like close enough, but because he's just got the news that like the letters were received and they're willing to talk, he feels he can at least do something there, because as much as we know he's the villain, he's not full villain, that he's ultimately trying to do the good thing, but he's always been coming at it from the perspective of being the like advisor who has to advise the sort of more kind of negative option to like counter, I suppose, Harrow's idealism. And now that he doesn't have the counterpoint of Harrow, he's kind of making all of the sort of harsher decisions with no one to really counter that. So it's an interesting arc for Viren as it goes on. But do you have any thoughts on him here and his decision to sort of like stop this ritual suddenly here, even though he does come back to it later?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really fits sort of his character, as far as, he's definitely not someone to sort of, go super crazy into sort of jumping into things. I mean, even if he does go on sort of the harsher sides of things, I think he's more calculating, I guess, in the way that he goes about things. So the fact that he does have, this other option, it gives him, a better sort of sense of what he can do rather than sort of going through, some method that he doesn't really know anything about. I mean, this whole sort of, potion or the spell that he's doing, it could do anything to him, and without any sort of like, up until this point, any real sort of communication, there's no way to sort of judge that. So I think, it's probably, he probably chose the better route, initially to go with this. I mean, it doesn't work out in the end, but it, it makes sense as far as, covering all your bases first before going down a path that, you may not be able to come back from.
Mm-hmm. Next, we move into this what I consider to be like the best two episodes of the season. It's basically a two-parter backstory episode. Episode 5 is Breaking the Seal, and we basically start immediately with Viren going to this meeting of the Five Kingdoms, and we get to meet the kings and queens of the other kind of human nations. We meet the king of Neolandia, the king of Delbar, the Queen of Evanir, and Queen Anya of Durin. I'd be a little critical here of them basically giving all of like the character focus to Anya and kind of just treating the other ones, apart from Viren, as just being very like background. They're really boring. They don't say anything, even though they're seemingly experienced kings and queens. It is the kind of younger queen who is the one who actually has stuff to say. I think it's a hard balance to get. I think it doesn't feel quite right here in that it feels like she ends up being like the smartest person in the room by virtue of the fact that they wrote all of the other kings and queens as being complete idiots with nothing to say. Whereas it would have felt better, I think, if they were all making their own valid points and she just happens to present a kind of a unique perspective rather than kind of necessarily what they did here. I think it's fine ultimately in terms of what they overall do here, with him deciding to tell this backstory to her because of the personal connection, to try and convince her, who seems to be the only like in general dissenting voice to him. But yeah, a little bit of world building here. Again, like we don't really know much about the differences between the different nations as such. Like I said, all those names, but like nothing is like stated specifically about them. They're just other nations with other kings. But what were your thoughts on getting to introduced to all the other kind of world leaders here?
Yeah, no, I definitely get your point as far as them, not necessarily having seemingly have any sort of real sort of importance. I mean, I guess I get the idea because, her mothers are sort of, sort of the idea behind sort of, why, the human sort of nation is the way it is because they were able to, have that sacrifice. So I guess, her story, it plays more into, I guess, sort of the current state of things. So, I see why the focus is there. And I guess, with the show, just sort of the demographics that is sort of like aiming for, I guess it makes sense that it would focus on more of the younger characters rather than the older ones. But I agree. It would have been nice to at least have, I don't know, even if they said like a specific thing about sort of the other countries, like sort of like what they're sort of known for or something like that would have, been a bit better just to sort of get an idea of, what the other places are like. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe even just show, their landscape or something like that would have been worth it or something. I don't know. I mean, I think they have like the tapestries there and they, I think they have like, some of them have an animal on them for the other sort of places. So maybe that's something that someone's already cued into as far as, what those other places are about. But other than that, there's not much that I gleaned, at least from the other sort of nations. So I think that's definitely something that they can work on, for sure, especially if they do ever get to sort of like a full out sort of scale battle, it would be nice to know something about the other places.
Yeah, and then again, go back to the point about the journey. It just kind of feels weird that like, okay, they're telling us about all these other kingdoms, and it's just like, wait, did Callum and Rayla, did they ever pass through any of these places, or is it literally just like Catullus into Xadia? Like it feels weird that like seemingly we may never get to see some of these places. I know in an episode or two, Viren sends out the sort of shadow assassin things to those
Hmm.
places, so we'll probably get at least a sequence or two in those places. But you have a whole journey set up, and you don't really go anywhere of note. Like they basically never give a name to pretty much any location, so that's a bit of an issue. But Viren basically leads the kind of presentation here. He uses some magic to kind of create a bit of a show here to get his point across. Just that there's war coming. The Sunfire Elves are at the border. There's dragons in the sky, just about ready to attack. And in his opinion, the human realms aren't ready. They need to all work together to basically strike back before they're hit themselves. And he seems to create a good point. Like I said, everyone except Queen Anya agrees, and she just says that she's undecided. But I suppose Viren realizes that he has to kind of tackle her a little bit differently because she's not just a kid; she's much wiser than she seems. So this is where the flashback comes from. He's going to tell her the story of basically what happened to her mothers, and as well as that, what happened to Queen Sarai. So this is sort of where we jump into the flashback. So he says that this is 9 years ago, which is exactly when Harrow became king. So we meet Harrow's wife, Callum and Ezran's mother, Queen Sarai. And there's some fun scenes here, just as we see them kind of all interacting. The family's happy together. Harrow poses for a picture with Viren. He wants Viren to be in it as his advisor. And what they get across here is actually some really good characterization of Harrow. Of just, we didn't get to see him for all that long in season one. Now we get more of him, and he kind of worries about the fact that he was born into sort of nobility, into royalty, and he worries about the people who have less than him. Sarai says that he is kind, and he talks about his idea of justice and this kind of dream that he had, and he chose the blindfold to sort of test the justice system and make sure that everything is fair regardless of circumstances. I thought that was a very interesting conversation in general that they had, and I also just thought that there was good chemistry between Harrow and Sarai as well. Just that they're a really kind of nice couple together. But what were your thoughts on this kind of first sequence here? I suppose getting kind of introduced to Harrow just after becoming king.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely does a really good sort of job of characterizing his sort of, his thoughts and his hope for sort of like leading his nation and just, the relationship that he has with his wife, I think is definitely, you can see, how it starts off here, how their sort of dynamic is with each other and just sort of, how they are, they play off of each other pretty well, which I think you definitely see later on how that works as well.
Yeah, and a little bit more kind of adult jokes as well, in that like he talks like Lady Justice, and she said, and he immediately is just like, no, she had a robe on, and then she sort of like teases him about it again. So that was interesting. Just that like they're adult characters, why wouldn't they kind of have a little bit of this and they don't go overboard with it? So that was kind of good writing, I think. And then yeah, this is where I suppose it properly gets introduced here. The two queens of Durin come to Harrow for help. These are Anya's parents, and they reveal that there's been famine in Durin for the past few years. Their resources are almost gone, and when winter comes this year, in their opinion, over 100,000 people will die. Harrow offers them help, and behind the scenes, Viren basically says that you need to be realistic. We have barely enough food to feed ourselves, let alone help other people. Harrow won't back down and agrees to help them as much as they can. Viren says that 100,000 people will still die. It'll just be like half on both sides. But Harrow sticks to his guns and agrees to help. So I like this. This is the, I suppose, quintessential Harrow Viren dynamic here in this scenario. And I just thought that this situation got it across really, really well. That here's Harrow doing this thing where his people will suffer a bit, but it creates this, I suppose, lasting relationship with one other nation because they're so heavily linked in this kind of issue of famine. So, what were your thoughts on the conflict here of this backstory?
Yeah, no, I think, definitely, it plays off of Harrow's sort of character, his sort of, idea of doing just in the world and sort of helping others, which is sort of, what he's always sort of trying to go for, which I think, it's a good thing to do, although, as Viren sort of points out, the practicality of it isn't sort of like the best here since, their own nation is has limited resources as well, but he does eventually sort of offer another solution, and that of course causes additional problems. But no, I think that dynamic, the sort of advisor sort of dynamic that they have here, I think it's definitely worth it. It's a nice way to see it before everything sort of goes sour later on.
Hmm. Viren comes up with a suggestion here, a possibility to fix this problem. He has this rock, which is the piece of a magma titan from Xadia. This piece of rock is warm and remains warm, and he says that the heart of this titan is this kind of energy source that's filled with warmth and light, and if they can defeat this magma titan and take its heart, he can perform a spell to basically warm the land and prevent the famine that's going to happen, and basically solve the issue that way using magic. Um, we cut and see that he's obviously told this, Harrow has told this plan to Sarai, and she has straight away has an issue with this. And as they're sparring with spears and swords, she talks about how, like, this creature's alive, does it have a family, is it the last of its species? She really disagrees with their solution having to involve, I suppose, in her mind, killing an innocent creature just to, save them. But Harrow kind of realizes that this is what he has to do to save everyone, including the people of Durin. Um, it's an interesting dynamic here in that Sarai kind of really kind of goes at him over this decision, but ultimately she does actually head out with him because I suppose really, it is like one living thing versus 10,000 lives, and that's sort of like they have to be willing to make that choice as the rulers of the nation, and it gets across the kind of conflict here of like why Viren, like, even though he always presents that more realistic side, you have to kind of have someone like that around, but you also have to have someone more idealistic around as well, and that's kind of what the whole arc of this is really trying to get at. But what were your thoughts here on the plan and the scene with Sarai?
No, I really like the scene with Sarai. I think that definitely was a nice way of seeing them sort of have a dynamic with each other. Like we've seen earlier how they can sort of have, sort of the quiet, sort of like calm, sort of conversation. And here you have one that's, obviously a bit more heated. Just the fact that they're battling while having this conversation, I think is interesting in itself. But no, I think, it definitely, points out a lot of good points as far as, just, one life versus others, which is always something that, comes up in life and just these stories in general. So I think it's definitely a nice way of presenting it here. So no, I think that definitely worked pretty well, and it's I guess in the end she does sort of defer to his sort of decision here, but she does support him in this decision to sort of go get the Titan's heart.
Mm. Yeah, I suppose she ultimately agrees because, like, anyone could be the one to shoot down ideas, but like if you don't have one of your own, like, what exactly are you doing to sort of help? So that's why she ends up kind of coming along. But it is interesting, like, they're obviously going to play up the idea of basically this kind of cycle of like revenge, cycle of hatred that happens because of basically this action happening, and Xadia and the human empire kind of going back and forth on this. But what happens next is that they do head out, they go at sundown, and they have to make it back before the sun rises, or else King Thunder, the king of the dragons, who's alive at this point, obviously, is going to come for them. They find the Magma Titan, though it's inactive, but when they kind of crack in and to kind of take its heart because they think it's dead, this actually awakens it. And then right at the end of the episode, we see that Callum hesitates to open the letter because he feels that, like, his father will be kind of gone for good if he reads the last words that have ever been kind of written towards him. but he ends up opening it right at the end of this episode. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on the very end of this episode? It's kind of just the setup for the fight and the letter being opened, but do you have any thoughts?
Um, I don't know. I think it's interesting just sort of the way that they're sort of timing this. I think that it definitely works well in the next episode too, for sure. But just sort of how they're setting up this, backstory of sort of us, and of course, eventually him sort of learning this sort of, the history of the humans, and then sort of, finding out sort of the truth behind everything at this point.
Hmm. Next episode, episode 6, is called Heart of a Titan. So we get kind of more intercuts here of Harrow's letter, and that giving us like his kind of current philosophy in the aftermath of everything that's happened. At the start, he talks about Callum's real father and how he tried to his kind of approach to being like Callum's stepfather has always been to like give Callum enough space, but also be directly a part of his life. That Harrow considers himself Callum's father, but also that he left that space there for Callum to still sort of, I suppose, remember his actual father, his birth father, which they seem to, when they say this, like basically imply that like, oh, because I don't think it was confirmed in like season 1, but that like Callum is not just like adopted. Callum is actually Sarai's son from like another relationship or another marriage. I think that's implied here without directly being said. I don't know. Is that what you got from this?
I don't know. That's what I'm leaning towards, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah, they weren't overly specific about it. And yeah, we see that like he basically knew that after kind of Thunder, what happened with Thunder, revenge was coming. They play with the kind of time a little bit here, in that the letter to Callum involves kind of like sort of skipping through the events after the flashback that they're showing. So like they just cut to like a brief flashback scene of Viren and Harrow talking, and they have like Thunder's horn on the table there, and they're addressing the fact that like conflicts come up because of what they did, and then by the end of this episode we learn why they went after Thunder in the way that they did. So it's pretty interesting the way it's laid out. But we get into the fight with the Magma Titan. It immediately begins to take out some of the soldiers that they brought with them. It's incredibly powerful. They can't seem to pierce it or do any damage to it. I think the Queens of Durin and obviously most of our leader characters begin to realize that they have to go through the cracks in its kind of armor plating. Amaya gets hit and kind of injured in the middle of this fight. And then Harrow orders them to fire at the crack that they made initially to activate the Magma Titan. So they fire the ballista into it and then push the ballista kind of off the edge, and this weight pulls the rock out, and then Sarai leaps in off Amaya's shield and kills the Titan with her spear. So there's something kind of like, I suppose, thematic about that she was the one who didn't want to come along with this, but in the heat of the battle to kind of save everyone, she's the one who actually dealt the finishing blow. Yeah, I thought there was some cool choreography here. Obviously the Magma Titan is just like a big giant thing that kind of lumbers around and kind of shoots a bit of magma and like punches and kicks, but just the power that it had versus obviously the kind of humans' technology and their skills, I thought was really well done. And then I think they especially got across the kind of the dynamic between the sisters, Sarai and Amaya, with their kind of combo attacks here at the end. The shield kind of boosts into the attack. I thought that was a really cool kind of finishing blow. And in the aftermath of this, they find the heart and they have it, and they think it will work. So, Greg, what were your thoughts on the first kind of section of this episode here?
No, I thought this was pretty cool. Like you said, the way that they were able to sort of, choreograph this whole sort of fight scene with the abilities that they have, since they don't really have anything, super crazy. It's all, I guess relatively primitive. But it definitely works well using their sort of individual abilities, which I think is pretty cool, because I mean they have to be pretty active and pretty nimble to sort of get around. Most of them, or at least are more sort of like characters with getting any sort of like major injuries. So no, I think that was actually done pretty well. I think like we've said before, most of their fight scenes are actually pretty cool and pretty well done. So I really like how they sort of set that whole thing up to actually get into the heart of the Titan.
Mm-hmm. In the aftermath of this, they realize the retreat home is going to be very slow because of the amount of people that were injured, including Amaya. And Harrow and Viren have a bit of an argument over this. Harrow refuses to leave the wounded behind, whereas Viren thinks that they should, to get home to obviously save as many people as possible. But they do have the slow march home, taking the wounded with them. And it's just, again, meant to further emphasize the kind of difference in opinion between the two of them, but they can still sort of be friends in all of this. Do you have any thoughts on this little discussion here over the injured?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's definitely, it does show a really good job of their sort of dynamic here. And sort of, this is a nice point of King Harold sort of sticking to his sort of ideas of, sort of, not leaving anyone sort of behind, even if, it possibly might make everything sort of worse in the end. So, it's, I guess it just really shows you just sort of the harsh sort of, realities and just, the tough time it has to be for, sort of a leader in this sort of position here.
Mm. Yeah, but there's also, I suppose, a hint of sort of villainy from Viren by like saying that like you're only doing this because your sister, your wife's sister is injured as well. Um, we could to see Harrow in the letter explaining to Callum to basically advise Ezran, because Ezran is obviously king now. And this is, I suppose, the key thing in terms of learning of Harrow. I suppose from you know through all these experiences up until like basically what he learned, I suppose, just prior to his death. In that he tells Callum to advise Ezran in basically love, not strength. That there's a certain strength in vulnerability, and to emphasize a narrative of love, not a narrative of strength. So that's, I suppose their way of saying to sort of like end this kind of cycle of hatred and don't make everything about just counter the next threat in Xadia. That something else has to be done, which is basically what Callum and Rayla are kind of trying to do here by bringing the Dragon Prince back to Xadia. So I actually really like this as just this kind of key moment here of basically Harrow telling Callum to be Ezran's advisor, kind of like Viren was to him, and to here's the approach that I've learned that you should have, that I maybe lost sight of along the way. So I like the character kind of growth here, kind of from the grave and away from Harrow. But what were your thoughts on this piece of the letter here?
No, I think that definitely, that whole sort of like ethos and pathos, it just sort of fits into sort of, what they're, trying to go for. And I think, Callum, he's already sort of like, this has sort of already been sort of like implanted in him already. So he's already sort of well on the way for this. But, it's nice, for him to sort of read this and have this sort of like re-emphasize to him, knowing that, what he is doing now, the path that he's taken, even if it is, going against sort of the grain of what most people would do in this time. I think it's definitely worth him actually sort of reading.
hmm I think it's at this point we have the little side plot in this episode of Rayla talking to the pirate captain guy, and the core of this, it takes place across like one or two scenes, is that he asks her like what she does, and she says she's an assassin, but that she's never killed anyone. And they basically get across the idea that like Rayla, like now, is sort of open to the idea that there's kind of something for her to do in like the direction of her life beyond just being an assassin, and she kind of hasn't figured out exactly what it is she kind of wants to do. It's not really tackled all that much as like a major plot point this season, but it's just kind of there in the background that, like, I suppose when this journey comes to an end, what is she going to do? Because they kind of haven't brought it up, but like she's sort of in a way like isolated herself, or like basically got herself banished from her own kind of like tribe, the Moonshadow Elves. We don't really know what the relationship is like given what happened. So I definitely would have appreciated a bit more on that, and that like Rayla is fun in a lot of this kind of season, but like I don't, they didn't focus too much on the character stuff with her just yet this season. But Greg, what were your thoughts on this kind of interesting scene of Rayla talking to the captain about the direction of her life?
No, I mean, I think it was a nice, time for us to actually, get some little bit of character on her, just her sort of reflecting on her current status of things. I mean, I think, for her to really sort of, I guess sort of develop into more of what she's going to sort of do in the future, I think they probably have to get to Xadia and sort of, focus on that whole aspect of just her being back and interacting with her sort of people and just seeing, sort of how that's received with everything. I mean, just the fact that if she does, return Zim and everything sort of, works out ish better than, they sort of, things are current at. I mean, that's definitely going to sort of help her sort of, along the way, even if she is sort of at the current time sort of a failed assassin.
Hmm. So yeah, then we get the, I suppose, ending of this backstory here. Thunder is onto them as the sun begins to rise. He's clearly furious about what has happened to this magma titan, and they realize that they're going to. Some of them are going to have to stay behind to hold off Thunder to let the heart get back into the human realm. And the Queens of Durin step up and say that this will be, their fight basically. That they're going to stay behind and basically, in a way, repay all that Harrow and Catullus has done for them. So they go on their horses, they dodge Thunder for a while, but this is all they can basically do because of obviously Thunder flying around. They just have like basic weaponry on the ground. They don't seem to have magic. Viren actually joins in, goes back and tries to help them, and has some effect by like trapping Thunder's head in ice. But he immediately breaks out and he hits both of the queens with his tail, and this basically is what kills them. This forces Viren to retreat, and then Sarai makes the decision further up the road that she has to go back and help Viren, because if Viren's killed, there's no one to perform the spell that will save everyone in the first place. So, she picks up Viren on the horse, but they're just chased by Thunder. He keeps firing lightning at them. They dodge, but then eventually their horse is hit, and Viren gets away relatively unscathed from this, but Sarai is kind of mortally wounded in this situation. So his narration is just that like he was there for her final moments, and we kind of cut to, I suppose, the aftermath of this, of just Viren telling the story of how like the sacrifice of three queens helped to save like 100,000 people. The spell ended up working out. It brought warmth and ended the famine. It made everything all the crops like fertile and stuff like that, and it worked. But these three queens had to die, but they became legends in the process. And then I think just before the queens died, this was also, I suppose, the most direct confirmation that they were actually a couple and that they kiss. And this obviously led to, I suppose, what ended up being potentially the most controversial thing in the season was just that they killed off the two kind of gay characters. I think because of the backstory and the way it worked, I didn't have that problem that people had with it. But like, I get the idea that they want like a character who stays on the show that is like LGBT. But backstory is kind of, it's a little bit of a different scenario, especially when it's not like a surviving character from the backstory. So it's a bit of a weird one. In general, I like this backstory and how it works. The idea of this sacrifice and the kind of intensity of what's going on here, it gets across the idea that in the aftermath of this is what prompted them to strike back against Thunder and kill him, because he killed the rulers of like some of the rulers from two of the human kingdoms, and this is what's caused basically the start of this series to happen. That Harrow is killed in the like first couple of episodes of season one directly because of the like reaction he has to this event. So I think it all begins to sort of come together here. I don't know if they're ever going to show us the full like them attacking the Dragon King Thunder and killing him and how exactly that worked. But there's always the potential that like season 3 or 4 or something like that they tell us that part of the story. But Greg, what were your thoughts on the kind of finish up to this backstory?
Um, yeah, it's definitely, pretty meaningful as far as just sort of, the sacrifice of the three queens and just sort of, how this was sort of able to sort of, basically, let the human kingdom sort of survive this, whole sort of, famine, time period that was sort of happening right now. I mean, of course, it, sort of, goes back and forth with, them sort of taking revenge and then that sort of coming back around. So, you can see, how this is sort of the start of the cycle. But, of course, they could say go back even further, being, how, the humans were sort of kicked out of the areas that they were originally in. So, it's one of those sort of tough things here. But I think, as far as the story being told, I think that was definitely done, pretty well. It gets across sort of, the past sort of history and sort of, highlighting, all of these moments that have happened.
Hmm. Yeah, Harrow in the kind of the letter kind of says the line, "Do not let your past define your future." So again, another way of just saying like he basically says as much like remember the past, like learn from it, but kind of let it go. Don't react basically just to everything that happens in the past. That's his advice to Callum. Viren, in the present, thinks that this story will convince Anya, but instead she actually decides that she's going to take a different path than like her mother's did, and she doesn't want to like sacrifice so many in terms of like joining forces in some sort of a battle, and this ends up sort of kind of convincing the others to just kind of follow along with her. And basically this just ends in failure. Like they haven't really come to any conclusion from this meeting. I can't remember the exact dialogue or specific kind of points that they were making, but the result is that Viren considers this a failure. But what were your thoughts on this part of the, I suppose the failure of Viren at the this meeting?
Yeah, no, I mean, her idea of, Queen Anya is just sort of, not sacrificing, however many countless, millions or ever whatever amount of people for this sort of event. I think it's, it definitely shows, I guess, sort of the strength of her sort of character and, just sort of, understanding the situation here. I mean, the other sort of leaders, they don't really say too much on it, just that they sort of, they just sort of won't support it anymore just because of, Queen Anya's support here. So, I mean, I don't know, I guess it's one of those other points where it's just like the other rulers, you really don't get much out of them. I think really only one of them actually sort of says anything against sort of Viren in this moment here. So, there's definitely more time needed to sort of build up them. But as far as Viren is concerned, this was just sort of, the last sort of straw here. And then with everything else, he's, completely sort of run out of options.
Hmm. The end of the letter is, I suppose, what we're kind of waiting for from sort of like secret reveal from the letter. The secret is that Harrow left a cube for Callum at the lodge that like they were meant to be in, but they obviously went off on their journey. So initially he felt like he missed it, but then he realized that the cube is the one he got like in one of the earlier episodes. It's the cube thing that points out which primal magic source a form of magic is coming from. It glows. And he reveals that it's an ancient relic of Xadia. It used to belong to the elven wizard Aravos, who was the master of all 6 forms of primal magic. And if you bring it to Xadia, it will unlock something there. And Harrow feels that Callum can be the one to do that. The item is called the Key of Aravos. And the final secret, the ultimate secret, is that Bait loves belly rubs. So that was a nice little fun thing at the end. And then the setup for the next episode is that I think on the boat they spot a dragon in the sky. And that was obviously what Viren had kind of set up, that dragons are beginning to also sort of scout around the human world as well. So, Greg, what were your thoughts on the, I suppose, full reveal on what exactly this primal magic cube is?
Yeah, no, I think that was pretty interesting when we finally sort of got that. I mean, we don't know sort of like what it's sort of going to reveal or anything, but just the fact that it is a key and that it is from Averos, which we do know who that is now as well. I think that's it definitely shows you that, there's definitely going to be some interesting, things that are going to happen later on. I don't know. I think it's cool that Calms, sort of has this sort of key here, and even how it plays into the story later on, I think is cool as well. But I think for his character to have this sort of element, and he just sort of happened to take it with him, even though he knew had some sort of connection to something. I think it's cool that he just sort of has it.
Yeah, and I suppose it's just interesting in the first place that like Harrow had this thing, that it belongs to Aravos, and something happened to Aravos, and it links probably in some way to the fact that like Viren has the mirror from like why does he have the mirror? And I think the idea is that they both these items were taken from the living quarters of the Dragon King and Queen.
Yeah.
And they have some important reason for behind why Aravos is in the position that he's in, but we'll get to that when more is revealed about Aravos later on. Next up is episode 7, which is Fire and Fury. So we see Xadia and Soren arrive at this human town with a big kind of tower with Corvus, and they're treating him as a traitor. And this is when like the dragon attack is sort of incoming, and we just kind of cut away as Soren begins to move to sort of lead the defense of the city against this dragon. On the other side of the story, we get the best kind of meme reference of the season. One does not simply walk into Xadia, which they kind of used there, which was pretty fun. And yeah, basically after this, it's just the big battle on the kind of tower here. I think, if I remember correctly, like he attacks the dragon first, and they kind of sort of make a point out of that. And yeah, he can't really do all that much. He comes close to hitting it with the kind of ballista a couple of times, but the result is that Xadia is actually forced to enchant one of these bolts, and she fires it, and it kind of magically tracks the dragon, and it eventually hits the dragon and goes down, but only after it's done a ton of damage. And then the core of this episode comes in from the fact that Ezran, Rayla, and Callum are kind of temporarily camping out in this sort of like cave in the cliffside, and they see this happen. They rush down to see the dragon, as Xadia and Soren are also kind of riding out to see the dragon that they took down. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the start of this episode with the dragon attack?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I think in this one you definitely see a lot of Viren and Soren here, just sort of his idea, I guess, of just leaping into sort of like battle. Because, I mean, they sort of, the guards or the people in the town said that the dragon has just sort of been scouting out the area. He hasn't, like, actually sort of like attacked anything. So, you could reason that if Soren didn't shoot the first sort of ballista bolt, that the dragon might not have actually done anything. Who knows for sure, of course. But this Soren definitely sort of, I guess you could say, escalated the situation here, which of course leads to him being in some tough times later on as the sort of season continues. So it's definitely I don't know. They're just, they're driving just more home the sort of the point of just sort of these battles and these sort of cycles of coming and going because of, one person doing something versus the other. So I don't know. It's definitely one of those where they're just, they're trying to sort of make you sort of, wonder who's really in the right in this sort of situation here, either side here. So it's definitely sort of hard to tell. But, I mean, with Xadia, she, her sort of enchanting that, I think it's definitely sort of interesting. She always seems to have a way of sort of helping the situation, even if she didn't sort of start off, these sort of like engagements that they have.
Yeah, I like the kind of jokes that she has later on. It's just like, it was always your dream to like take down a dragon, but I did it, and I don't even care about that. And she just kind of relishes like laying that into him. But the rest of the plot is that Ezran rushes down to help the dragon. They manage to get the bolt out of it to, I suppose, ease its pain. It doesn't appear to be like a deadly blow in any way. It's just sort of minorly injured the dragon. It's in pain because the thing's in its side. It's sort of kind of unconscious a little bit. But they kind of leave as Soren and the rest of the guards arrive to kind of inspect the quote-unquote dead dragon. Rayla then goes down to save the dragon. She kind of gives a little bit of a speech to Callum about that this is something that she has to do. He then remembers dark magic and that this might be the opportunity to use it, that he has to do something here. So the result is that Rayla tries to help the dragon, but it hasn't got up yet. She can't destroy the chains that they've put around it. Callum then comes down, uses dark magic, because he remembers the rune from a picture of Xadia that he drew, and then takes one of the kind of worm slug things that Claudia has to use it. So this destroys the chains. He then collapses after using dark magic. The dragon then wakes up and confronts Soren. Soren does manage to chop the horn off, one of the horns off the dragon, but is then sent flying into a rock by the tail of the dragon, and he seems to be just completely out of action. This all comes to an end after Rayla gets Callum to safety. Zim runs away from Ezran, who had stayed up at the cliffside kind of cave where they were camping out. The dragon backs down when it sees Zim. It kind of goes up, kind of sniffs him a little bit, and just leaves. Like, Zim doesn't seem to like do anything. The dragon just leaves the second it spots Zim. Claudia then rushes to help Soren, and it's revealed that he is really, really badly injured. It seems that he is kind of paralyzed from like the neck down. So really, really serious injury here. What are your thoughts on this? I didn't expect him to kind of have one of the main characters suffer like this bad of an injury from an attack like this. So what were your thoughts on it?
He is fighting a dragon. That is a pretty drastic thing. I mean, I don't know. It makes me really sort of wonder, sort of how they were able to take down Thunder, because it just, it definitely seems like a really sort of, hard feat to do. But, I guess with, dark magic, maybe anything is sort of possible in that sort of instance. But I mean, the whole sort of, the whole way of they're sort of going about this, about, sort of Rayla sort of coming down to sort of, protect the dragon, because that's sort of like, it's probably just something that she feels just because, they had the whole history with her parents and that sort of backstory. So it definitely seems like something that would be in character for her to do. And, Callum sort of, resorting to sort of desperate measures here of using dark magic for the first time, maybe the only time to sort of, help Rayla out, just shows, how much he wants to sort of, do the right thing, even if the way that he went about it this time might not have been sort of the best way of doing it. But no, it's definitely a pretty, serious way that they do this here. And, the fact that Soren does get, so injured in here, even though, with magic and everything, there's almost always sort of like a way out of most things, even, with other people who we think have died in the first one, there's probably other ways around that as well. So I don't know, it's interesting just to see that they did it. It definitely had its impact sort of in the moment, but again, overall, I guess it gets kind of sort of lessened.
Yeah, like the dragons, it seems like their most effective attack is the tail slap. Like there's like, it's what, 3 characters nearly killed by that, and then only 1 by the electric breath. So that's an interesting kind of decision, but obviously I assume Thunder probably killed a lot of people in however big that attack was. I think if you watch the opening to like nearly every episode, you see at least like a screenshot of like what the idea of that fight, of like Thunder up on this kind of like magma ridge and just this whole army in front of him. So that gives you an idea about what it's like. Last part of episode 7 is Viren. Obviously, this is the time when he's desperate. He goes back in, takes the sheet off the mirror and goes ahead with the rest of this kind of ritual. Stabs his hand, puts the blood into the kind of potion mix. And what Arvos does is that he this worm just crawls out of his mouth. It's like a centipede type thing, and he drops it into his potion, and it comes out of Viren's potion. So that's how it was like transferred. It's kind of like a teleportation type thing. And the worm basically crawls onto Viren's ear, and this kind of speaks for Arvos. So that's how they deal with the communication problems. And Arvos, the first thing he says is that he's waited so long to hear the sound of another's voice, and he wants to serve Viren. So this is interesting in that his first line of dialogue immediately kind of confirms something to us in a way of just like, okay, so he is isolated from everyone else. He has no communication with anyone, and this is the first time in potentially, who knows how long that this has actually happened. I suppose given that I'm trying to remember where the flashback of when we see him actually is. I think that's more of an ancient one that relates to like the first guy who invented dark magic, but I don't know the specifics. So how long exactly was that? But either way, they imply it's a very long time here. He's sort of an ancient elf, and it suggests some sort of a like fall from grace for him, that like he goes from potentially being one of the leaders of one of the factions of elves to being imprisoned in some way, magically imprisoned. But what was your take on this, of just the fact that he's kind of isolated based on his dialogue?
Yeah, no, that it definitely makes it seem like something, something big sort of happened early on. I don't know, maybe it has something to do with sort of, the whole idea of humans and having dark magic, or maybe he, had some other sort of failure. I mean, I don't know. There's only so much you can gather just from a couple sort of interactions. Even later on, you don't really get too much more. You get a little bit more with sort of sort of when Viren tries to find out a bit about him. But it's definitely it's pretty intriguing. He definitely seems like, I guess, from the little bit that we know of him, which isn't really that much. He has some sort of mystique around him that definitely makes him an interesting character, even if we don't know much about him.
hmm We move into episode 8, which is called The Book of Destiny. And I suppose we'll tackle the Claudia and Soren plot first. So Claudia tries to heal Soren with dark magic, but it doesn't work, and she begins to sort of panic. Eventually, she has to accept that they're going to have to bring him to a hospital. So they bring him back to the town where they came from, and basically, it's just revealed here that he is paralyzed. That, as far as they're aware, no medicine can heal what's happened to him. And when she actually goes in to talk to Soren, Soren's reaction to this is really interesting, because he basically completely understands the situation, and in fact thinks that it's for the best. He's actually sort of happy that this happened in a way, because this way, unable to move, he can't fulfill the secret mission that Viren gave to him, which was to kill the princes. And it's at this point he reveals to Claudia that he was told this. Now, if I remember correctly, it was also the case that Claudia was separately from Soren told basically the exact same thing. So it is kind of a little bit of a plot point in this episode that like Claudia doesn't really like say to Soren that like I was told the exact same thing. Am I remembering that correctly? That like Claudia was also told like basically the same thing, to like kill them if she has to.
Well, her thing was to focus on getting the egg back, and if so be it, leave Soren behind. So
Okay,
I mean,
okay.
yeah, it was still like a drastic thing, but it was just just focus on your specific thing, and like in case, and I guess if she went through with what she was told, she would have had to leave Soren as is.
Yeah, because because when she's using dark magic, and then she sees Soren's badly injured and goes over to help him, um which allows Zim and Ezran to get away, I believe, in that situation. So she's already sort of gone against that idea. So yeah, that's interesting. That actually adds a lot to it. That she is just utterly unwilling to do that part of the mission if she had to, at least based on everything that's been presented right now. So um, that's interesting. But yeah, the fact that Soren basically is willing to accept this level of injury and like no recovery, in part just because so he doesn't have to do this thing that his father asked him to do. It obviously speaks to sort of like the loyalty that he sort of has to his father. That like he not the loyalty. It's just the dynamic that he has with Viren, that he's sort of afraid to go home as a failure, and then this is his sort of like get out of jail card in a way. But it's this kind of dark version of it. But what was your take on his, I suppose, reaction to being injured and the positive that he takes from it?
Yeah, no, I mean, his character is always sort of kind of odd, so he can really sort of go any way with what he's really sort of thinking here. And I mean, just the way that he sort of decides things is, like when he before he had to take off, here he was supposed to sort of kill the princes or Ezra, and he sort of made the whole sort of the slide sort of thing, the rope swing, just to sort of get around, feeling bad about killing them directly. But he had no problem with doing it sort of like indirectly, or even when he was attacking sort of Rayla, like he said, like he just needed 1 second for her to be awake so that he didn't sort of feel bad about it. So he wants to do sort of what he's been tasked to do, and sort of he's committed to doing that. But he has some level of just sort of justice within him, or just sort of doing things and sort of the right way based off of his sort of mentality of doing things that he wants to he wants to do it the way that he can do it, just not sort of like I guess sort of the worst way ever. I don't know. It's an interesting way to sort of thinking about it. So yeah, I mean, this is sort of his, like you said, his sort of get out of jail free card. Like he doesn't have to feel bad about disappointing his dad because he's paralyzed. He can't do anything. So he comes up with this whole other sort of mentality of what he's sort of going to do. But of course, his sort of sister isn't sort of willing to sort of let that go yet.
Yeah, I think with both of them, you can definitely tell that it's this influence from their father that is like the only thing that sort of in any way has them leaning towards like being villains kind of in any way in the series. That like without like the darker aspects of his personality kind of like coming across in them, they're basically hero characters in a way, like supporting Callum and Ezran in this whole thing. So it's going to be super interesting to see, like, when we get to it, obviously, like, probably next season, their reaction to what's happened to Vera now, and do they decide with both or one of them separately that this is the point to, like, make a decision to go against or completely side with their father. So that's definitely interesting. The other side of this episode is that in the aftermath of him using dark magic, Callum is in this kind of like fever dream type thing, and he's having these sort of visions. This first section is about, I suppose, him and dark magic, and will he fall to the influence of dark magic? And it's him and this sort of dark version of himself, and the dark version of himself urges him to accept dark magic and embrace it because it's his destiny. This is his way to get magic. He knows that magic is important to him and is kind of like part of him. Accept dark magic, and that's what it's about. And just as he's about to accept it, Harrow kind of speaks to him, this kind of spirit of Harrow, and says that he's free and that he's free to choose differently than this. And ultimately, Callum makes the decision to side against using dark magic. And I suppose you'd maybe think that, oh, that's the end of this fever dream, but it's not. It kind of transitions into this other thing where he's kind of like on his own, he's wandering, and it ends basically with him sort of like falling into the ocean and beginning to sort of like drown in this kind of vision. And there's lots of kind of wind kind of stuff going on. He kind of envisions himself as the sail of a boat in a storm. The pirate captain is there, visions of birds and all this stuff. So it's very kind of sky magic-y, wind, storm stuff going on here as we end. So it's very kind of conceptual kind of stuff going on here. But what are your thoughts on Callum's kind of dream kind of sequence here?
Yeah, no, I mean it's definitely interesting the way that they go sort of about expressing his sort of like inner ideas and his inner sort of turmoil that he's sort of having here as far as using dark magic versus trying to figure out a way to use primal magic, versus sort of his sort of role in sort of doing things, and sort of what sort of has influenced him over this journey that he's been going on towards sort of bringing the Dragon Prince back. So I think it's definitely, I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, you definitely can remember when Avatar did something similar here, and just sort of the whole idea of just sort of the subconscious sort of dream and sort of how you're sort of going to come out of it. And he also has like the connection with his mom later on, as we see here. So I don't know, it's definitely interesting how he goes through these different sort of phases in this dream. So it's definitely it's multi-level. It's not just sort of one thing that he has to sort of figure out.
Yeah, and the final part of this episode is that Corvus finds Rayla and everyone, and in announcing himself, reveals to Ezran that Harrow is dead, because he basically says, like, King Ezran, and this is what confirms it to him. And the interesting thing here is that obviously Callum is out of action while this reveal happens, so Ezran can't, like, speak to Callum about what has just happened. Similarly, I suppose Rayla isn't really the person for Ezran to talk about this to. And the result is that Ezran kind of leaves, unable to accept this, and Corvus eventually goes out to look after, to see where he's gone. He finds some tracks, and it looks like Ezran's been kind of taken by a wild animal. But when he returns to Rayla to reveal this sad fact, Rayla just bursts out laughing and is just like, he can talk to animals. He's probably just with that bantha somewhere, and that is exactly what it turns out to be. But uh, we end the episode here with Claudia, who's obviously kind of freaked out a little bit at the end of seeing her brother become a poet. Freaked her out so much that she had to be escorted out of the medical facility, and she finds Ezra in town, and they begin to talk. So what are your thoughts on the Ezran section of this episode, him finding out the truth?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess it was only a matter of time before he sort of finds out. And it's interesting how they do it with Callum being out, so he can't sort of give any sort of explanation or any sort of comfort. So, I think it's definitely, you see, it's like an instant sort of like thing here. You see Ezra sort of become, a bit more sort of mature in like an instant here, knowing that, his father, the king, is no longer around, even if he's still, trying to sort of, cope with this in his own way. He gives, like the command to Corvus to sort of let him go so that he can be by himself here. So, it's definitely, I think that was one of the things that I was wondering for a while, how he would sort of react to, to the fact that he is now, the king to be. So no, I think it's definitely interesting, and it's cool to see how this sort of development is sort of happening, and this is the end. So there was really only one more episodes after this to sort of express that.
Hmm. And one last thing with this episode is that we get probably one of the most interesting sequences with Viren and the whole Arvos thing, and that once Arvos tells him his name, eventually he says that my name is Arvos. Viren kind of almost immediately goes out and into the library to look for information on Arvos, because he sort of obviously remembers this name to some degree from something. So he opens up a bunch of texts, and the second he begins to look at it, it disappears. So he starts to read, gets like, oh, Arvos, but then it all just fades away. Visually, we just see the information going off the page, and he basically can't look at information on Arvos, and they don't really explain exactly what this is. Arvos doesn't later either, so it just appears to be some sort of aspect of the kind of worm thing, the spell, the potion thing that allows them to be in contact. At least that's my interpretation of it, because I don't think it's just a case where like any information to anyone goes away. I get the impression anyone else looking at that book probably can see it, or else Viren looking at it under the spell eliminates that information, but that if anyone else had looked at it before, they could have seen it. But Greg, what's your take on this, the information being unable to be looked at about Arvos?
Yeah, no, see that's the interesting part. Like, I don't know. I mean, that definitely seems like a way that it could have worked, but I also thought that maybe it was because he was sort of like banished into this, this world. Maybe he created, he committed such a crime that, looking at this sort of information with the intent of actually sort of using it regardless of the person would have sort of made it sort of vanish. Just sort of, if you know what you're sort of looking for, and this is sort of the thing that it would sort of just vanish. I don't know. I thought maybe it was sort of like a more of a global sort of thing, and maybe he didn't necessarily know about it beforehand, although he did sort of find it pretty quickly. So maybe there is some sort of link there, with, because he did have the spell, he just can't sort of figure it out. Or I don't know, it could even be something that maybe Avra sort of like did something with the spell so that whoever he's talking to can't sort of figure anything else about him. I don't know. That would be interesting if he did have that sort of like foresight of mind, that this guy who I'm giving the spell to might want to find out about me, and maybe they shouldn't, because that might affect how they think about him. I don't know. I don't know enough about Avaros to know if he's sort of that sort of calculating, thinking that he would do that sort of thing. I mean, I guess, if Varen wasn't on sort of like the wrong side of everyone in sort of the kingdom, maybe he could have had someone else, or like the librarian, look at it and see what they see instead. That would have been interesting if he could have tasked someone else with doing that.
Mm. It's interesting because obviously Harrow from the letter we know at least knows some facts about Arvos. Just the fact that like he can do all 6 forms of magic, he's this elven wizard, and the key is his key and stuff like that. So that suggests that like he potentially has looked at this information. I think the idea also seems to be that like this information is realistically wouldn't feature anything about like anything bad that he did to get like trapped somewhere, because otherwise why would Harrow then be recommending like Callum get involved in like a key of his and stuff like that. So it's for some reason Arvos doesn't want like Viren to know about the like general knowledge of like who he is in some way. So that there's obviously something about like who he is just at a base level that he doesn't want Viren to know about, because he's willing to let him know his name. Viren probably knows what type of elf he is just from looking at him, but there must be something else. Maybe it is like he has some like mastery over it. Maybe it mentions the key and he doesn't want him to know about the key in some way. Though I probably get the impression that the key maybe frees Arvos or something like that.
Yeah.
Knowing the way that this works, but we'll have to obviously wait and see about that. Still, I think it's interesting. Just that scene probably is the most interesting aspect of the whole Arvos thing, at least so far, just because in the grand scheme of things, like all of the scenes with Viren in the mirror, like there's only like a handful of scenes that are actually like notable. There's actually anything to read into. It's usually just Arvos saying something sort of cryptic in some way that like, you know, I want to serve you, but also don't trust me. Like he directly says that to Viren, not to trust him, and so on. So I don't really know exactly what they're going to do, but we've still got an episode to talk about. Episode 9, the last episode of Book 2, is Breathe. And I suppose we start off with the Claudia and Ezran stuff. So they talk, they go up to the tower that was kind of destroyed earlier on to talk. And Ezran, obviously Claudia knows he's just found out the information about his father, but says he doesn't have to talk about it if he doesn't want to. Instead, she actually talks about, I suppose, a similar experience for her, which is where their mother is, basically, where Claudia and Soren's mother is. And she says that her mother was not really around much because the mother split up with Viren, and the kids were basically asked to choose which parent they wanted to stay with. Soren immediately chose their father, and the mother, because of this, basically told Claudia to stay with Soren, and then the mother left. Claudia kind of, I suppose, explains to, I suppose, in part to herself, just that obviously the mother left to be happy on her own, but it is the hardest thing that's ever happened to her. So, I think for me, like, I think it seems like this that make me be like, I think Claudia, like, at least right now, is the best character on the show, just because I think there's the most, like, depth and complexity there, in that there's a lot of real stuff, but then she also is like very clearly sort of, I suppose, influenced in a way, corrupted by dark magic, but also her father, but is also this incredibly nice and caring character at the same time. And what decision she ultimately makes is very interesting to me, especially because I think the most obvious romantic connection on the show seems to be Callum and her. So I'm, you know, I don't know how much to really say about this exact sequence with her mother. I would have liked to have maybe seen a little bit of flashback here, just like get what their mother looked like or something like that, a scene of them being younger, but I think it was basic enough to where I can accept it just being told to us here. But it's nice to just get across the idea that, like, you know, they've all kind of dealt with something like this. But what were your thoughts on this backstory from Claudia?
No, I think it was nice. It definitely works in this moment. It gives, these two characters, Claudia and Ezreal, a little bit of a connection here, just sort of with everything that he's sort of dealing with. And I think, the way that she sort of describes it, there's not much, I don't know, much extra that's really sort of needed to sort of explain it. You pretty much get sort of the idea of sort of what was happening and sort of the build up, and just knowing sort of Varen's sort of character in general, you can get the idea. And she even mentions it herself, how sort of like intense he can be about things. So no, I think it definitely was a nice sort of touching moment here, and it does add a lot more sort of depth to her character. And yeah, we probably do know probably at this point the most about her. And I mean the fact that she does use dark magic and that's considered evil. As far as the show's sort of leaning towards right now. That it definitely adds more depth to her character rather than just sort of like maybe even Callum and Ezra just sort of being sort of on the good side, the more better side of things. Just sort of with everything that's sort of happened so far. I think, Ezra, now that he knows his dad is no longer here, and the same thing goes with Callum, I think it definitely sort of adds more to them. But, just the fact that she has this sort of, duality to herself, I think is definitely, it makes her more, interesting as far as that goes, so far at least.
Yeah, and especially with the reveal within this episode, which we'll discuss a bit in a minute, that seemingly humans can actually connect to the primal magics. How is she going to react to that? Because in like episode 1 or 2, I think it is, like she very much is kind of like, as humans, kind of like we have nothing except this dark magic, and that's why I choose to use it. It just kind of opens up the option for her to kind of still be a mage, but like the correct kind of way. And I suppose it's all about how corrupted does she get before she learns about this, really, because what happens here is that she realizes, okay, Ezrin can talk to animals. She knows about. She seems to the idea of like dark magic is that specific creatures allow you to do specific things, and she's thinking about how to heal Soren. And okay, talking to animals, he can basically help me find any animals. She leads with the idea that she wants him to help her find a specific type of fruit, but by the end you realize that this fruit is where this specific animal would gather, and it's the animals that she actually wants, because it's this group of deer. I don't think they specifically named the animal, or because like panther, it seems to be like hybrid, like badger kind of panther type thing. This deer didn't seem to be overly like hybrid. I didn't focus on it too much, but either way, it's these deer. Pretty much after they find the animals, like Ezrin just goes back, and the next time we see Claudia, she basically just charges into where Soren is kind of in the hospital, and she already has dark magic activated, and she just does this crazy thing where you see like all the like nerves basically in his body kind of reactivate, and it does heal him. So it actually does fix him. He can move again. It does seem to like only fix the direct like paralysis thing, in that like he still has broken bones, which I thought was kind of weird that like it just targeted that but didn't actually heal the broken bones. But either way, he can move again and can feel again, which is the important thing. But Claudia begins to suffer a little bit more for the dark magic here. We specifically note one kind of streak of her hair goes white, and the dark eyes of the dark magic sort of lasts a little bit longer here, and it seemed like this kind of took a lot out of her to use this specific spell itself. And it was just getting across, I suppose, the lengths that she goes through to help her brother, in that it's this nice kind of brother-sister thing, but it's also how many animals did she have to like kill, like suck the life force out of to make this happen. And that's the sort of like duality with the character of how far is she willing to go with dark magic, and before she kind of becomes as corrupted, I suppose, as her father by it. But yeah, it's a nice moment at the end. The last thing that they do this season is that they have a kind of a talk. They're about to head home. They kind of are like, we have this dragon's horn. I think that might get us out of this kind of crazy situation, because it's a dragon's horn. Who knows what dark magic you can do with that? And the key thing, obviously, is that at this point, they don't know going home that Viren has actually been captured and what he's been up to this whole time. So things are going to drastically change for them next season. But what are your thoughts on the last kind of bits of Claudia and Soren in season 2?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, a pretty sort of intense scene here, just seeing her come in with all the sort of like dark magic sort of charged up and sort of reconnecting, I guess, sort of his nerve endings, so that he's not paralyzed anymore. It definitely seems like that's a upper level, or just, it definitely takes more, obviously it takes more sort of magic out of her. So you see the hair, which I think Varen has one too. So clearly you can see how how dark magic can affect humans, and probably not in a good way. So, it makes me wonder how much of this power eventually, will it sort of like corrupt you from the inside. So it definitely adds more intrigue to sort of what, she's going to have to do later on. And, I don't know, the fact that they do have the dragon horn, how will they be used, or will they even be able to talk to their father when they get back? I mean, it sort of seems like, I mean, I guess, they're both in pretty, kind of bad shape at this point. So, it doesn't seem like they're really sort of, focusing on, like the rest of the mission. They're probably just gonna have to try to like recoup, and maybe they'll call themselves off the mission now that they find out what has happened to their father. So that'll be interesting to see for sure.
We go back to Callum's dream sequence, and this time, obviously, we saw that he was kind of drowning last time we saw him. Here we see that Sarai, his mother, the spirit of his mother, kind of urges him to breathe. It seems like he's kind of panicking. She tells him to focus on the present. She says, what does she say? Head, hand, and heart, mind, body, and spirit. And just again urges him to breathe. They begin to kind of like use the symbolism, the words that relate to sort of wind, air, breathing, and they immediately cut to outside basically, and Rayla at this point is holding on to Callum because he's gasping for air in the dream world, but also outside as well. And she says that she cannot lose Callum, and she says, I dot 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 dot, and you don't know what she was going to say. And he wakes up suddenly, and she seems really embarrassed about what she was just about to say. The only thing I can think is that she was about to say "I love you." The only thing that makes me doubt that is just that romantically, I haven't got a lot actually between Rayla and Callum for the most part. Apart from like a tiny bit of jealousy on Rayla's part towards Callum and Claudia's relationship, I haven't really seen all that much between them. I get they're sort of close, but like not in that way just yet. So her potentially saying "I love you" so soon seems kind of odd. But again, we don't know for sure exactly that she was going to say that. It could have been just like heat of the moment, he's dying, something like that. But what was your take on this? The kind of Callum sequence here of the last bit of his dream and the Rayla scene.
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely was a heat of a moment type thing, but I mean, I don't know, maybe it's love, maybe it's just she likes him. I mean, it could go, I guess, a couple of different ways. I mean, there's not like a huge, amount of, more deeper sort of, relationship here that we've seen so far, but, who knows, what could be, developed over time here. But, I think it's a nice way of them sort of doing sort of how he's sort of feeling in the dream versus how he's sort of acting in the real world. So I definitely like how they do that. And with what comes from this sort of whole sequence here, I think it's definitely, I guess it's kind of fitting how this sort of turns out.
So he wakes up and basically says that he understands the Sky Arcanum. They also doubly confirm this by the fact that the Arvos' key actually glows with the Sky Magic symbol. So he has unlocked this. He now has Sky Magic. He says that the whole world is a giant primal stone. Breath, sails, birds, wind. He talks about how he was trying to find his wings, but like he is the wing. And then he uses the Fulminous spell, which he used previously, but this time he does it on his own without the aid of a primal stone, and so he just has sky magic now. I like this to a degree. I think they should have done more depth on this to explain like what exactly he did, because in the first episode they seemed to make it fairly clear just that like humans aren't born with this connection. You can't learn this type of magic, and Callum was trying to make that connection. And then I think the dream sequence was a bit too kind of dream sequency, kind of esoteric, like just what's going on, kind of mumbo jumbo, that it lacked just the succinctness of a good explanation for like what exactly did he do to get this power. Because you could then go back and be like, But when Lujain explained the Moon Arcanum to him, could he not just understand that and unlock it then? Because like they seem to confirm that just knowing that is not the case, and she basically explained to him what the understanding is, but he didn't get it, but he gets it here. I think the problem here is that they don't really want to go fully into how exactly magic works. What is it within you, like physically in a way, or magically, that actually gives you magic? Um, and the distinction between, I suppose, what does it mean to be born with this inside you versus Callum apparently creating it, or are they saying that humans do have it inside, but that in magical creatures it's unlocked from the start, but that it's just kind of buried deep down in humans, or what? To me, it was just lacking a bit in the explanation, and given that it was like a whole arc, a whole season long arc of him learning magic, I was a little let down right at the end by just, okay, he has it now, but I don't really get why, or the details of what specifically happened. Like, to put it, I suppose, overly simplistically, it's just like, okay, he was told to breathe, and they talk about birds and wings a bit, and I know it now. It's kind of like, really? Are we good with that? But what was your thoughts on him having sky magic at the end here, and how they went about it?
I don't know. I don't know. I didn't. The whole sort of dream sort of sequence of their sort of like way of, I guess sort of, initiating him into having sort of sky magic. It really just seemed like, I don't know, to me, it was more of just like him personally having sort of like a deeper connection with sort of the element in order for him to sort of, in his words, sort of understand it. No, I don't know. It seems like the whole idea of them sort of like having this understanding of the magic in general, it's not something that can be explained. Like there has to be, either you have to be born with it, or I guess in Callum's case, you have to have, some sort of, dramatic sort of event that allows you to sort of like unlock this sort of ability. I mean, it's definitely not like a hard fast rule that we know about it as of now. I mean, I don't know, this seems like something that, would be explained later on when he comes into contact with another mage that has, the similar sort of, sky magic sort of like, power or something like that, that they would probably be able to sort of, explain sort of this connection more. Or it might just be one of those things where it's just like, it's one of those sort of like odd occurrences since, up until this point, as far as we know of, no human has ever had this sort of connection. But, for some reason, of course, our main sort of character has this sort of deeper connection. And, it could be something to deal with the sky sort of arcanum that he sort of had before, the primal stone that he had before. So maybe that, sort of allowed. I mean, I'm sure there's like a whole bunch of different sort of like theories on what could be sort of his, what has given him this sort of connection with the sky element. I mean, it definitely seems like it's not something that you can just sort of figure out. I mean, it makes me wonder if he'll be able to get sort of like the other ones. Will he be able to get like all six of them? I don't know. That seems like that might be a bit sort of drastic, but I don't know. Maybe if they're sort of trying to have him as sort of like the opposed to Eros, maybe they'll, figure out a way to do that. I mean, I don't know. That seems like that would be like a lot of development for them to develop, especially with it being, five other elements that he has to sort of figure out. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that I guess sort of, goes along the lines with the whole sort of like Avatar sort of idea of having the elements and all the powers. But I don't know. It doesn't feel like that to me, at least, that's the route that they're sort of going to go for. I don't know. It'll be interesting. I think it'll be really interesting to see when he gets to Xadia, and if he shows, or if he's able to show, since, there seems to be so much animosity between the two races, sort of how that whole sort of aspect is going to be taken. It definitely seems like it's something that would sort of mess up the status quo, and maybe not in a good way.
Yeah, I think with the whole sky magic connection thing, it's weird because like I'd never really say that just like Callum as a character, like I'd necessarily associate him with sky magic. Like he tries to do sky magic because that was the primal stone that he had in the first place. And that, like, if it was a different primal stone, he'd be talking about a different element here. So inherently, like, is it really sky and like some sort of deep connection he has to the sky that's going on here? none of the rest of his character seems to me to really relate to the sky all that much. Like, apart from the fact that, like, okay, they're trying to teach like Zim some sky stuff, and they kind of have to that duality going on. So kind of like you say, I kind of almost lean towards the direction of like, I do get the feeling he probably will get multiple forms of magic.
Mm.
Will they go down the road of being at all six? Like you said, it's just sort of kind of like mirror image of like him and Aravos and what they seem to be doing there. But the obvious question would be like, okay, so now that he's unlocked this one and he knows the idea behind, say, like moon magic, can he not just meditate in some way and unlock moon magic now that he kind of has some form of an understanding? The problem is that like they never really made it clear what like caused this spark to happen. Like in this case, like he uses dark magic for the first time and falls into a coma, doesn't fall to dark magic, and then immediately that transitions into him unlocking sky magic. So was it a case where like him using dark magic for the first time like awakened something within him, but because he didn't get corrupted, it like, oh, you are
Mm.
magical now, and that there is some. I think there probably is some like deeper thing to dark magic, beyond it just being the evil kind of really bad thing. I kind of get the impression it probably may end up being sort of more treated like the sort of energy bending of this world, where it is this sort of like, it is a seventh form of magic, but dark magic is just kind of one way of treating it. It's more like life magic or something like that, and there is like good applications of it, and like
Yeah.
it is something humans naturally can use, and because he used it for the first time, like, oh, he's now magically like awakened, so he can make connections to other things or something like that. Um, like you say, it probably is a case where now that he's opened one, we'll have to see how the second one goes. If they're just crossing over the border based on the fact that they have like Sunfire elves, I get the impression it's sun magic stuff that will probably be what they encounter next. And can he learn that or not immediately in some way? And this is where we're going to have to get into, I suppose, sort of kind of Avatar types things of like with Aang, like he has the latent ability within him to bend all four elements, but before he could just do that, he has to kind of understand a little bit of the philosophy of that element. Is that just the case now for Callum, or every single time that this happens, does there have to be some sort of a he falls into a coma, has a big dream sequence thing every single time? Um, and that's where like the unclear kind of nature of this comes from. In that like this isn't like as simple as just saying that like you got like airbending because of harmonic convergence, or you got firebending because the lion turtle gave you that ability. Now it's up to you to master it in some way. This is kind of still sort of vague that like, is it just philosophy, or did something like energetically happen to him, his body, because of the dark magic to get there? I'm not sure. I don't know how technical they want to get with this, to explain like literal magic in this case. But we'll move on. We'll move on. Where are we here? So we still have. Oh yeah, in the I suppose the next thing, yes, is Ezran does come back, and pretty much immediately reveals that he won't be continuing on the rest of the journey with Rayla and Callum. That he's going back to take on his role, his responsibility as king, and he's going to leave with Corvus and Bait, but he's going to have to leave Zim to go off with Callum and Rayla. I really liked this because I was sort of worried with kind of him as our kind of really young character, you know, connected to animals, that he just be sort of stuck in that sort of role where like he'd be doing stuff like in the early episodes, like, you know, holding Zim over his head, sort of half teaching him how to fly. This to me feels like, okay, here's a way to sort of like emotionally develop Ezran kind of in a way separate from this main quest going on, where he's gonna get the chance to like develop on his own, become this leader, potentially deal with some of this politics stuff going on here. Something could happen, like it could require Rayla and Callum to have to come back to help him out in some way, but especially with what they do a little later on with the psychic connection seemingly with Zim, there's a lot of interesting stuff I think with Ezran doing this. I think it surprised me that they made this decision, but I actually really like it that they're making a sort of kind of big notable change, and that it kind of feels like we might be able to deal with some very different stuff with a smaller group traveling through Xadia, just Callum and uh, Rayla with Zim. That's kind of interesting, and I suppose it'll be interesting to see if there's a specific dynamic that Zim has with like either one or the other. Uh, Most of the characters just seem to kind of get on with him fairly well, but like does something more develop, it would be interesting there. But what were your thoughts on his decision here to go back and accept his role as king and not continuing on with the rest of the journey?
Yeah, no, I think it's very, it's very sort of mature thinking of him, of, sort of the kingdom and sort of the people that, he's now responsible for, even if they do have, someone else who stands in as his sort of like, the main sort of advisor. No, he's, that's a role that eventually he's going to have to be groomed to be in, to be taken. And, we don't know how much sort of like, training he's had sort of already, but, it's something that he knows he has to do and that he's not sort of, shrugging off. So, I think it's too bad that we're sort of like breaking up the group, here, but, I think it sort of makes sense that that is sort of what he would do. And we have seen other, young characters, Queen Anya sort of rule their kings, or at least, make decisions on the behalf. So, I think it fits the role of this world. And, since that does seem to be the focus of the kingdom in general, is having the prince back, I think, it makes sense that, one of them would be back. And, I think I don't know, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how that works. And what I don't know what sort of power and what sort of responsibility Ezra actually has in the kingdom, especially with who probably would have been his advisor, Viren, being locked up now.
Mm. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting because just from this experience, this first part of the journey, Ezra is now has this kind of completely different like world view in a way of like he's going to be like kind of very pro, I suppose, Xadia, like because he was part of the journey to bring Zim back, and like how open is he about that? That like does he just reveal to everyone that the Dragon Prince, like my brother and this elf, are bringing her there? How secretive does he have to be about this, and how open can he be about the fact that, as far as he's concerned, like elves are actually all right, that this war is just like this kind of artifact of the past, or what's going on? Like Viren being out of the picture, like who is going to be the obvious advisor? Corvus feels more like a bodyguard than like a advisor type character. So is it going to be that woman who I don't even know her name or what position it is, but the one who kept criticizing Viren most of this season? She potentially, I'm not sure, but there's that, plus the whole idea that like Caro's letter to Callum was like basically to be Ezran's advisor, but now they're sort of separated. Is there some significance to that? I'm not exactly sure, but it's gonna be interesting, kind of I suppose politically where things go. That like we have two very young rulers now, and if they form another meeting or something like that, like what would Anya and Ezran's like interactions be like? As like suddenly two of the rulers of the kingdoms are like really young. Um, Things like that I think are fairly interesting. So yeah, the other stuff that we have here is okay, Viren. There's kind of two sequences here with him. The first one is that he takes Arvos' advice. Of Arvos basically gets him completely on the side by saying that like you offered them like help by like loyalty and trust. They threw it back at you. That's like the worst thing anyone can do. Now they deserve to only be treated to be like motivated by fear. So he obviously gives him the information needed to perform this spell that he performs, which is that he is going to motivate the other kingdoms by fear by sending these shadow warriors to all of the other kingdoms to create terror in some way. So this is obviously his way to like force them to make a political move by like attacking them themselves, but it's going to, because it's magic, it's going to look like it's Xadians that did this. So interesting kind of political move. We'll see exactly how it works. Like are these assassins directly sent after the kings and queens, or is it just to kill people in general? But what are your thoughts on him sending these kind of shadow assassin people?
Yeah, no, this is definitely where you see him, really become, I guess, sort of the bad guy, the evil guy, you could say. Just, the fact that he's willing to go to these lengths in order to get people, to sort of cooperate on their sides. I know, it's definitely, this is probably, one of the most serious things that he's done in direct sort of confrontation to other people, other than sort of his next sort of scene here. And, depending on, the type of damage that these creatures actually do in the other sort of kingdoms, it could, really well sort of motivate them, or if it gets out sort of like who's behind this, how that's going to sort of affect, this kingdom itself.
Hmm. And then, yeah, the next thing he does, they eventually find out where this secret chamber is, where he's actually talking to Arvos, and he prepares to fight. Arvos urges him to get ready to fight. He says that he'll help him. We see Arvos kind of like activate his magic. It seems like he's sort of different in that like his eyes glow like this unusual kind of like pink kind of chrysalis pattern or something like that, and he does these crazy big signs, and the magic is really powerful. And yeah, he just starts to use all the different elements in here. And I think they only focus on like the really obvious ones of like he uses sky magic for the lightning, water magic, fire magic, and it's pretty crazy because you see like guards get like turned to ash. One of them just is turned to ice and shattered. So he's killing people here doing this. But eventually, enough people come in. Arvos suddenly urges him to stop and give up. Viren thinks he's been betrayed, but Arvos says that the worm will stay with him to communicate and help him in some way. So, interesting end to the season for Viren, in that like he's separated from the mirror, but he still has that worm centipede thing with him, and he's just going to be put in prison on trial in some way. We'll see exactly how they approach doing anything from here, but an interesting end to just see kind of almost failure. Like it looked like things were going to go all right, but then Arvos just decided, no, you have to accept what's happened here. So, what are your thoughts on this interesting turn for Viren?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Everest told him to sort of accept it, but he's still with him, so it still makes me think that he still has some plot to sort of, help Varen, or Varen will figure something else out on his own. I mean, just the fact that he is a dark magician, I mean, he probably can do something to get sort of out of jail, even if they do sort of like limit his resources. I don't know, I'm sure there's any number of things that he could probably eventually sort of think of actually doing here. But yeah, no, it definitely is an interesting way to sort of conclude his sort of, it looked like he was sort of, going to make sort of progress. And, I could still see what he's doing, sort of working out for the better, especially if all the other kingdoms do survive and they do come to the kingdom or something, there's a lot of different things that could be played out here for sure.
Mm-hmm. Next we have, Callum and Rayla and Zim continuing on the journey. They they're nearly in Xadia. They arrive at this lava river with lots of stones that sink when any sort of pressure is put on them. The moon suddenly comes out and lights up this moonstone path, and you can stand on these stones for a little bit longer before they sink, and this is the safe way to get across this kind of final kind of stage of the journey into Xadia. So they basically just begin to walk across. It's all fine. But then suddenly the sun begins to rise and they're in danger. Everything begins to kind of fall apart. They're going to be killed. Zim ends up kind of stopping and just calling out, and it seems to like connect to Ezran, who's obviously pretty far away, traveling the opposite direction at this point. And it seems that Ezran can directly like see through Zim's eyes, at least temporarily, and understand what's going on. And he basically tells Zim that you have to block the light and urges him to fly. And like Corvus lifts up Ezran to kind of mimic the idea of what he has to do to fly. This causes Zim to actually kind of do this as well, and he flies for the first time, but falls down a little bit. But then Callum uses his sky magic to create a kind of wind boost, and he gets up onto this kind of big stone structure and spreads his wings out to block the light. and it gives them just enough time to get across the lava bridge. Um, I thought it was a interesting little thing. As like our final action sequence in a way of the kind of season, I thought it was a little dull. That like the journey's been just very mundane up to now, and then just right at the last second, it's this kind of like magical moon path across lava right at the end. Just there's a little bit like there's no fancy things like this along the way before, but it was cool enough. I think it fit what was going on this season, that it was this combination of Zim finally learns how to fly, plus Callum uses his magic to assist him. It was that made sense. It just wasn't like the journey in general into Xadia just wasn't all that interesting. I think is ultimately where I stand on this. But this sequence was fine. I think they'll do a lot more in the future with the whole Zim Ezran connection. I think earlier on in this season we even saw that like when they were asleep, they would like mimic each other's movements with whatever they did. So there's some very, very deep connection between these two in some way. Now, is it more than just Ezran having a connection, or is this some special dragon ability? I'm not sure, but it's very, very unique that this is there, and that Zim pretty much sees Ezran as kind of being this sort of like father figure in a way, so that's going to be an interesting one to follow. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this kind of final sequence kind of here across the lava?
I mean, I think it was okay. I mean, I guess as far as like, endings for seasons, it's not sort of like the most sort of like exciting thing that you could ever sort of happen. But I mean, I like the idea of just sort of them using sort of, the different abilities, him flying, like you mentioned, and then, Callum using the sky magic. I think, that aspect of it is definitely pretty nice. I mean, I don't know, maybe it is, like you said, it is just sort of the journey. I mean, I guess, I don't know, part of it might just be because it was, so short overall. I mean, just the fact that the whole season itself is just 9 episodes, and, most of it is, the journey, 4 or 5 or however many episodes. Maybe they really needed, more time to actually, sit down in any sort of location and, sort of build up the area that they're in. I mean, I don't know, it is cool that they did do, a couple episodes on sort of the whole sort of flashback aspect, which sort of, definitely does flush out the world. But I guess as far as where, they're going to, and, sort of, I don't know, the idea of Xadia, which, I don't know, it seems like it has this bigger sort of like, I don't know, presence about it maybe. It's sort of been built up a bit that, sort of just getting into it now doesn't seem, as sort of grandiose as you might have thought it might be. I mean, you do get to see, the dragon at the end. So that is, that is a cool aspect of actually finally getting there. But, I don't know, maybe we're just going to have to wait until we really get into, Xadia to really sort of see what all the talk has been about.
So yeah, the very, very last scene of the episode of the season is they cross into Xadia. It seems like all's going well, and then they look up, and on the sort of immediate cliff face there is a dragon. Callum is shocked. Rayla seems to know who this dragon is, and is just like, "Oh no, it's him!" And she calls it Soul Reagan, and it's the dragon. And specifically, this is the dragon that has appeared in most of the promotional kind of screen, the like images that came out before the show even came out, like on like the main kind of like logo kind of concept thing. It's this dragon with its kind of head crest, I suppose you'd kind of call it, with the kind of wing kind of type things that it has going on there. And then the fact that this is a named dragon as well, like we have Thunder, who's the king. We got an unnamed dragon this season, and then here's someone called Soul Reagan. Now obviously they're in that kind of sun area. It's called Soul. It's obviously a fire dragon of some sort. There's obviously some significance to this dragon in that it's been in promo materials. How Rayla specifically knows about it, I think, is quite interesting, and what exactly that means. Because obviously, previously we'd know that, like, oh, Zim, they have Zim with them, so Zim, being the Dragon Prince, should protect everyone from things. But if this is a dragon notable enough, like maybe there's like dragon politics. Maybe this is the guy who wants to be king, and maybe it would be in his best interest to get rid of the prince and stuff like that. Who knows exactly? But an interesting kind of cliffhanger reveal. Obviously, like it's a little bit kind of like not as exciting just because like it to some degree like it is just a dragon. Like we don't actually know anything specifically about this one, but they tried to make it come across as something really big because they give it a name and like they're just into Xadia. But it's cool. It means we're going to immediately jump into next season and have this interesting confrontation. But what are your thoughts on this specifically named dragon that we've sort of seen in material before?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's definitely cool the way that they sort of set it up, and the fact that, like you said, we will, go into it, next season and immediately have, some sort of conversation with here. I mean, I wonder if there's some sort of like history with Rayla and sort of like her backstory with this dragon, or just with the dragons in general, that might sort of like stop them from actually, really getting into Xadia. So I don't know. There's, it's cool.
Yeah, and yeah, it's one of those things where like I suppose in general, like I think we're sort of waiting for some sort of a like world building type reveal on the dragons and like how exactly it works with the idea of like there being a dragon king and queen and them having like chambers where they like store magical artifacts, and in that like so far they've just been presented as being like animals, like powerful animals, but for the most part just animals. Like that there's like what makes them like the sort of like in a way like king and queen of the magical world, in a way that like they would have that leadership position more so than like the most powerful elf ruler or whatever. So I definitely want to get into I suppose more of the like the I suppose sentience of the dragons, and that like this psychic connection, maybe because like Zim is so young, there's no kind of like speech, but maybe if Zim's older, maybe there is like a psychic voice for like Zim as a dragon. Who really knows? But do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think in this show the dragons are literally just dragons, or is there going to be some sort of a deeper reveal that they kind of like elves and humans are like more of a sentient species than we think?
I don't know. I mean, I kind of want to say that it would make sense that they would be, have more sentience rather than just sort of like, just straight up sort of animals. I don't know. Maybe some of the lesser dragons aren't as more sort of involved, but I don't know. They seem to hold them in such high regard, and they seem to, I don't know. They seem to have, or at least I get the impression that they sort of like interact with the actual people, the elves, more than just sort of up on high. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading into it too much. I mean, they really could go anyway with it, just it being sort of this sort of magical world. I mean, who knows? They could have other, sort of forms that we haven't sort of been made aware of, where they interact more with the normal sort of like elves and stuff. I don't know.
But yeah, that's been our discussion on the Dragon Prince season 2, book 2, Sky. We don't have any information, I believe, right now about book 3, season 3. I think they basically are kind of, it's like a kind of unwritten kind of thing that like, yeah, we're getting season 3. Why wouldn't we be getting season 3? But like, it's not confirmed, and so it kind of leaves the show in a kind of weird position that like they're just kind of confirming it like one season at a time, like a month or two after it airs. So I hopefully they kind of speed up that process of confirming like when the next season is coming. We didn't end up, I suppose, waiting all that long between book 1 and book 2, but I'd kind of hoped that they'd kind of confirm that the show was getting like do the Voltron thing of like, oh yeah, it's confirmed for another like 70 episodes or something like that. I think that's probably something that needs to happen, just so we always know kind of what's coming next, and it's not so stop start in between seasons. I think they do a lot on social media, but it's stuff like that, the really clear and obvious stuff, that I think they should be doing it a little bit more on. But well, I suppose what are your thoughts on that? The fact that season 2, it's been a really really successful and popular show. What do you think is going on production wise with it, with regards to like why they potentially haven't been like confirmed for loads more seasons, or whether or not like announcing that sort of stuff?
I don't know. I mean, it makes me think that there is just more, that they are waiting for more sort of, I guess, I don't know, statistics or results or whatever. I mean, from the little bit that I know of it, it seems like the show, at least there's people talking about there's an active sort of community sort of around it. Enough that it would make sense that there's enough for them to sort of keep going with it. But I also know that the whole idea of the whole sort of like company was that they have like it's going to have different mediums and of ways of them sort of like producing the content for the show. So maybe they're switching to one of the other forms now. I don't know. I mean, I would think it would be in their best interest, as we've mentioned before, for other shows to sort of, keep the hype around the show going, keep the buzz, keep, at least, some sort of, social sort of contact with, the fans or the people that are interested in the show going, just so that they know that there's more coming of it. That's usually the best way to keep things going. But I don't know, maybe it is such up in the air that they can't really say anything yet. I don't know. I don't know how the production really is going for this being, sort of the Netflix show that it is.
Mm. Yeah, the only other thing they've been talking about is that like they've been mentioning the video game like a little bit more in kind of recent
Hmm.
interviews. I think we got like one or two of these concept art style screenshots of the game. It didn't really like, in my opinion, like show off too much of what it's going to be, but they continue to like really specify the idea that it is more of a sort of like world building style game, that it's more telling its own story, and not it's not a retelling of season 1 or 2 of the show. And that like it's one of those things where like they're kind of almost saying that like the characters from the show may be involved, but it's not like about them as such. So to me, that's sort of something like if it's just a kind of maybe small-ish game where like you get to like explore the world, I think that's kind of exactly what the show needs right now. Like, give some names to these locations that we're getting to see, so we kind of
Hmm.
uh, understand the world a bit more, and that sort of thing. Because right now, like they're putting out more information on like social media, but at the same time, it's like you have to check out like posts like 56 and 57 from the 300 they've put up on Twitter this week. 'Cause they're very active on Twitter, and it's kind of hard to keep track of, and that sort of stuff. And it as popular as it is, I think it is just a case of like it still has a small enough number of episodes where like there's a community here I think wants to get into it really hard, but until it gets the confirmation of like it's going to be like 9, 10 seasons or something like that, it's always going to be like I think people just waiting until like they fully commit, and then we'll fully commit as fans in a way type of thing. So yeah, like you said, I'm kind of waiting for this kind of cross media stuff to fully start. Like when are they going to put out like books, comics, that sort of thing, and fact file books. I think for this show, those type of fact file books could be like really interesting. Like the few that they did for Voltron, were solid, but Voltron was fairly kind of clear about most of how this stuff worked. Um, this show I think could really benefit from something like that, kind of Avatar Lost Scrolls type thing.
Hmm.
So yeah, I hope they get on top of that stuff. I think they've put out some merchandise. I saw some people mentioning that there was like kind of plush toys. I've seen a few people talk about a plush toy of Bait a couple of times. I don't really know if it's like exclusive to anywhere or not, but there's some merchandise out. I think they just recently released the soundtrack for the first 2 seasons as well, so that's kind of a good sign. I think that's roughly what Voltron did, like a season or two in. It started to go more heavy into that sort of stuff. So I think it's a success. I don't think there's any way that this stops. But for me, definitely, I hope they just become clearer about the release schedule. So you know we're not just waiting here for the next 2 months for them to confirm when the next season is. But overall, I like it, and I just kind of want more depth on the world building. Would probably be ultimately the main issue I have right now. Once they give that and the locations start to become more interesting, I suppose the main character plot becomes more of a interesting plot. Uh, then I think the show is really going to take off. But I like what's here so far because the character stuff is really strong, and there's some good backstory as well going on. But what are your final thoughts on book 2 of The Dragon Prince?
Yeah, no, I think it's making good progress. I think it's building towards something which I think is, sort of half the battle and to make it seem like it's worthwhile. It definitely seems like what they're doing, the goals, the whole idea of getting back of, certain the world right. I think that's enough there that it makes it interesting that there's, enough people around it and the characters are fun, it looks interesting. It looks pretty good overall, that, it has enough it has enough of a following that it's worth, keep going. I think they just need to do, sort of like we mentioned, just sort of, maybe add some more depth to some of the characters and sort of, set the stage for actual sort of like locations that they have sort of mentioned, and then that'll really sort of like help, make people be able to sort of more, really sort of commit to the show. And, if that happens, maybe that'll actually, benefit them on the other end of, making it seem worthwhile for, other people and companies to sort of like invest their money into it. So I don't know. It definitely seems like it's going the right way though for now.
So yeah, that's been the end of our review for Dragon Prince Season 2. We'll of course be back whenever they confirm and the third season comes out, whatever they decide to call it. I get the impression it probably will be Book 3 Sun or Soul, whatever exact terminology they're going to go for. But yeah, we'll review that. Next podcast will be an Avatar one, in that I think there's a bit of Avatar comic news to catch up on, so that's what we'll be talking about on the next podcast. But yeah, that's been this episode. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye bye.